We're going to begin to stand up and clap our hands. We're going to sing out that song, A King Who Reigns. Sing these songs of praise to Jesus Christ. There's a King who reigns over all of my tomorrows. And there's a King who reigns over all my yesterdays. And there's a King who reigns over present circumstances. And I'm glad that Jesus is the King. So I choose. So I choose to trust Him, and I choose. There's a King who reigns. There's a King who reigns over all of my tomorrows. And there's a King who reigns over all my yesterdays. There's a King who reigns over present circumstances. And I'm glad that Jesus is the King. So I choose. So I choose to trust Him. And I choose to pray. Let's give praise to Jesus Christ one time. We're going to slow it down this evening now. I'm going to sing out that song, Exalted Are You, Lord. Jesus, anointed one, your life has conquered death forevermore. Jesus, declared the Son in power, raised up Lord of all. You are Lord of all. Exalted are you, Lord. Exalted are you, Lord. You are high and lifted up over every other name. Exalted are you, Lord. Exalted are you, Lord, to receive glory and honor, to receive praise. Let's give praise to Jesus Christ one more time. And we subside, I'm going to ask if our brother Edwin Getch in the Crow's Nest would open us up in prayer.
Good morning, good morning, good morning. We're going to continue on in our study of biblical stewardship. And we're going to look today at child stewardship, for lack of a better term for it. And I notice most of the adults here that have kids, all their kids are adults, and then everybody else doesn't have kids. But nonetheless, everyone with kids that's supposed to be here, you just tell them, all right? So we're going to look at, and we're doing a Bible survey on stewardship. So we're actually building off of themes that are introduced to us in Genesis. So they're introduced in Genesis, and sometimes they're introduced in other books in the Bible. But for the most part, we're looking at things introduced in Genesis that are part of the fabric of creation. So God, when He created the world, He didn't just create a paradise and just say, okay, guys, do whatever you want with it. There's responsibilities. And because we are a culture that rejects responsibility, it's hard for us to sometimes understand that. And this is why America is a big mess now. It's all about doing your own thing. And how many people know your own thing is sometimes really, really wicked? And we don't like to admit it, but it's true. I need someone to get Matthew 25, 14 to 19. This is our foundational text. Jonathan, why don't you get that for us?
Matthew 25, 14
to 19.
For the kingdom of heaven is like a man traveling to a far country, who called his own servants and delivered his goods to them. And to one he gave 5 talents, and to another 2, and to another 1, to each according to his own ability. And immediately he went on a journey. Then he had received the 5 talents, went and traded with them, and made another 5 talents. And likewise, he who had received 2 talents gained 2 more also. But he who had received 1 went and dug in the ground and hid his Lord's money. After a long time, the Lord of the servants came and settled accounts with them.
All right, so this is probably one of the most important parables in the Bible about stewardship. But, and so this gives us pause to think about our responsibilities in life. What does the word stewardship mean, by the way? Will? You put in charge of something that's not yours, but you still have to take care of it. That's a pretty good answer. Anyone want to add to that? Because really, it's a responsibility we have with everything that comes into our hand to use it for the best purposes possible. So I would tell you that just because somebody gives you something to keep, or you earn something, quote unquote, it doesn't mean that it's yours to do whatever you want with it. You say, well, I bought this, I worked hard for this. Ultimately, everything is sourced with God. And so you can't even explain where you came from. You know, you came from your mama's womb. Well, that was a miracle of God right there. Whether you're happy about being alive or not, that's up to you to decide. But your life is something given by God, your breath. Therefore, you have responsibility to make the most of it. And again, this is a very unpopular belief in modern society. We should call it really postmodern society, because it's totally illogical that somebody who is born with male parts should suddenly decide to identify as a girl at the age of 10. Well, that's somebody taught them that. Somebody put that in them. Because when I look in the mirror, it's pretty clear that I am a male, right? And if you pee standing up without it running down your leg, you're a male. I don't care if you get confused about that later. Just remember what I just said. All right? Actually, the Bible uses the term, he that pisseth against the wall, to refer to men. It's actually in your Bible somewhere. I'm not going to look for it. I don't want to get sidetracked completely. I already took you off the track right now, so let's get back on. In that verse that our brother read, Matthew 25, who's the man traveling and who are his servants? Will? All right, it represents Christ and his servants. Exactly. Exactly right. And what is a talent? And what do the talents in the parable represent? Austin?
It's a unit of currency, but we use it as like abilities and stuff.
Yeah, exactly. So it's actually a unit of currency. It's a silver coin, very valuable in the time of Jesus. But we have adopted that word in the English language to refer to any gift that must have come from God that we have. So if you could sing, you know, not everyone has that gift, right? So theoretically, God must have put that in you. That's the thinking. And how does self-interest undermine stewardship? This is from last week. If you were here last week, you ought to be able to answer this. Even if you weren't here last week, it's pretty common sense. How does self-interest undermine stewardship, Sue? Right, so there's a responsibility. Your responsibility isn't just toward the item, it's toward the person that gave it to you. Whether that's God, or if your dad loans you the car or your uncle loans you the car, you know, you could die if you don't return it in the good shape, right? Especially if it's an expensive car, you know. It's like, hey, uncle, can I drive your classic car to the prom? And he says, are you crazy? See me in about 40 years and I know you know how to drive. I'll let you borrow it then. How does, so self-interest is putting yourself first. So I'm going to do whatever I want with this. I don't really care what people think. I earned this. I made this money. I can do whatever I want with it. This is my life. I can do whatever I want with it. That's actually not true. If you live that way, you will have a very short and unhappy life. And that's why rich people go to psychologists and celebrities are taking psychiatric drugs. Why so many famous people blow their brains out. Because they've lived this way without considering that their life doesn't really belong to them. How did Noah reverse the curse that mankind's sin placed over creation? What did Noah do? And you can even add to that the second question, what made him different from others in his day? So what did Noah do? So all of creation was being cursed. God decided he was going to do what with the creation? He's going to destroy it, right? So what did Noah do? Will? Yeah, he literally saved the creation. God was wiping it clean. He literally, and why did he do that? What made him different? John? Faith, that's a key thing, right? Without faith, it's impossible to please God. And so this is important. It's not perfection of performance that gives you favor with God. It's putting your faith in him, that you have faith in him. Doesn't mean you believe the right things. I know a lot of people believe the right things that have little faith at all. Faith is total trust in God. And how did the people of Babel undermine the stewardship principle woven into creation? Will?
By creating, instead of going forth that God said to propagate the world, they stayed in one spot and created a tower.
Yeah, they basically chose to disobey God's command to Noah and his descendants to repopulate the earth. And they actually said, there's a phrase they use. If you remember the story, does anyone remember the phrase they use? We will build a tower to do what? Tyler? No, but that's what they were thinking. But Josh? Make their own way to heaven. Okay, but what do they actually say, Fernando? Make a name for ourselves. I'm going to be famous. We're going to be awesome. We're going to be great because we're Americans, by God. Make America great again. Build back better. And so this is how Americans think too. So we got to be careful. Greatness is something supplied by God, not by ourselves. And so, anyways, let's move on. So now we're going to talk about this issue of child stewardship. A lot of scriptures today, so I need a lot of volunteers. Psalm 127, verse 3 to 5. Vincent. Proverbs 22:6. Fernando. Genesis 4:1. Tyler. Genesis 4:20 to 22. Joanna. Genesis 4:23 to 24. Kyle. Genesis 4:25 to 26. Eric. Luke 11:1. Kim. 1 Timothy 5:8, Sue. Isaiah 66:13, Arona. Proverbs 23:13, Jonathan. Deuteronomy 6 to 7, will be Austin. Matthew 9:14, Will. Genesis 22, 1 to 3, John. 6 to 8, Josh. 9 to 10, Fernando. 11 to 12, Arona. 13 to 14, Kyle. 1 Samuel 1, 8 to 9, Will. 10 to 11, Vincent. 17 to 18, Eric. Verse 20, Kim. 21 to 22, John. 24 to 28, Tyler. 1 Samuel 2, 1 to 2, Jonathan. 1 Samuel 2, verse 6, Sue. Verse 11, Josh. Romans 15, 1, Kyle. Matthew 10, 37, Joanna. James 4, 14, Arona. And then I guess the last one here is 3 John chapter 1, verse 4, Fernando. So I hope everyone got to read at least one that wanted to read. All right, let's look at child stewardship. Child stewardship. Psalm 127, verse 3 to 5.
Lo, children are an heritage of the Lord, and the fruit of the womb is his reward. As sparrows are in the hand of the mighty man, so are children of the youth. Happy is the man that hath his quiver full of them. They shall not be ashamed, but they shall speak with enemies in the gate.
All right, so what does this verse teach us about our children? Tyler? They're a blessing. That is the opposite of what humanity thinks. Modern fallen humanity thinks people are the problem. That's why we have abortion. Right? That's why we have abortion. I heard somebody complaining to me because I was standing up for life, and they said, well, who's going to adopt all these kids? I go, do you realize that there are thousands of children in China and Russia being adopted by Americans? Why wouldn't they adopt an American if they had a chance? It's just a patently stupid thing that people say. So if you're a misanthrope, which means you hate mankind, look, I don't like people all that much. I'd rather live in the desert 3 miles from my nearest neighbor with a sniper rifle. That's how I would rather live. But God has called me to something different. We have to live with people. But that being said, people are not the problem. Sin is the problem, not people. And so the world is full of liberals and humanists that are anti-human and very illiberal about the potential for people. I believe people have potential, right? I don't want to tell people because they're of a certain color, they don't have to try as hard in school, right? That's what they do, right? And if you think I'm making that up, you can talk to my wife. She's a public school teacher. And so this is what's going on in America today. We're dumbing down people because we actually hate people. But what else does this teach us about our children? Where do they come from? What are they? They're a blessing. What do you do with a blessing? Do you squander a blessing? And so it teaches us that we have a certain responsibility. Because they're from God, they don't belong to us. They don't belong to us, then what must we do with them? Well, it's like your uncle with the classic car. If you're going to borrow the car, he's going to give you rules on how you ought to take care of it. We need to follow those rules, right? We need to follow those rules. Require certain things. Proverbs 22:6. So that's good teaching. My kids kind of rebelled against us when they were in high school. That's kind of normal for teenagers. My kid that rebelled the most is probably the most conservative now. The one who gave us the most trouble turned out to be the one that's got his head on probably a little bit tighter than his other brother. They're both doing very well. And they've turned out much more like my wife and I than I would have expected. They're in their mid-20s. They're in the military now. They're very different than they were in high school. But because the foundation was laid when they were young kids. And now they're gravitating, they're starting to see the wisdom of what Dad taught us. Right? And it sucks if you have bad parents. That sucks. It sucks if you didn't have a parent. Your father or your mother was out of the scene. But it doesn't mean you have to become an idiot. All right? So learn from good examples, if there's any out there. But the bottom line is, Mom and Dad, this is your responsibility. So don't sit there and think just because you tell them to do something and they're 14, they say, I hate you. That's good. That means you're raising them right. That means you're doing something right. So don't cave into them and start having keg parties at the house when they're 15 because they said, if you don't let me have a keg party, I'll hate you forever, Mom. But some people do give in. That's the problem. Let me ask you this. Are you a friend of your child? No. You're not their friend. You can become their friend as they get older. I can honestly say I am probably friends with my oldest son now because he's quite mature, right? He's late 20s. He's got responsibility. He's a captain in the Army. My youngest son, he's almost there. Still learning a few things. But they're not really your friend. And if you raise them like your friend, you don't spank your friends, do you? Sometimes you're going to have to spank those kids. I don't care what the state says. When they go running in the street, believe me, a little pain on their backside will keep them on the sidewalk for the rest of their life. All right? So you can report me. My kids are all grown up now. It's too late to take them away. I kicked them out of the house when they were 18, actually. I sent them away. And they wanted to go. All right, praise the Lord. Genesis 4:1.
And Adam knew Eve his wife, and she conceived and bare Cain, and said, I have gotten a man from the Lord.
So think about this. Cain's name means acquired from God. So what she's saying there, they call him Cain because I have acquired him from the Lord. Actually naming their first child as something that God gave them. That's pretty interesting. That means Adam and Eve understood something about their children. What did they understand that we sometimes forget? Will? Well, they're a blessing, but what else? What else? Kyle? Yeah, the child was given to them. It's not something they created themselves. Right? Although you could tell your kid, you could tell them, hey, I can just kill you and create another one just like you. You could tell your kids that sometimes. Wow, you guys are so serious. Like, I can't believe what an abusive man pastor was. No, when you raise boys, it's okay. It's okay to talk to them hard. Right? That's why boot camp is so lame now, because kids today don't like to be talked to hard. Just so you know, I went to boot camp in 1983, before your parents knew each other. All right, praise the Lord. I'm just being a jerk now, so I'll stop. But the point, one of the reasons I joke like this, though, is because we can sometimes take ourselves too seriously when it comes to raising our kids. We have to see it for what it is. I have a job to raise this kid to be an adult. It's my responsibility. So I can't get too emotionally invested in the child in the wrong way. I love my child, therefore I want them to be raised right. But how many people know that means you're going to have to use tough love? right? Not friendship love, not pal love. They're not your pal. They can become a pal. I could honestly say I was a friend of my father for the last 30 years of his life. But I was his enemy when I was a teenager. And he was so happy when I left at 18. Even though he loved me, our relationship changed over time. And that's how it should be. So, Adam and Eve understood something that a lot of parents miss out on. And I thank God I got saved right before I had children, because I have no idea how I would have screwed them up if I didn't know some of these Bible principles. Because again, I was a rebel. I was like, I'll raise them the way I want. You know, my parents were wrong. They were too strict with me. Thank God I didn't go down that path. And maybe it's because they raised me fairly strict that it was easy for me to be strict with my kids. I don't know. Lamech, who openly rebelled against God, had gifted and talented children. We talked about this man last week. Go ahead and read Genesis 4, 20 to 22. Yeah, whatever. It doesn't matter how you say it. We'll let it slide. All right, so these were gifted children. Lamech rebelled against God, but his children had these tremendous gifts given to them. We would call them talents, right, from that parable today. How did Lamech fail his stewardship of his children? How did he fail? And again, if you weren't here last week, I wouldn't expect you to really know this, but how did he fail him? What did he do that made him such a wicked man? I referred to him as the first gangster rapper. Who knows what he did? Kyle?
He took for himself 2 wives.
That was one of the things he did. And then he killed a man who offended him. And then he sang a song about it. That's what it says in the Bible. He made up a song about it and sang it to his wives. It's pretty jacked up. And and so he justified his sin, and so he became a bad example. That's really what it comes down to. He became a bad example to his kids. And again, God's not requiring us to be perfect when it comes to raising children. How many people know that? We're going to make mistakes. And there's going to be a lot of heartache involved in raising children. Because you do love your kids. Just talk to someone who lost a child. Find out how they feel. And so it's hard to understand when you don't have kids, but you got to understand this, that all God's asking you to do is be a good example. That's all you have to do. You don't have to give them anything except your exampleship. Genesis 4, 23 to 24.
Then Lamech said to his wives, Ada and Zillah, hear my voice. Wives of Lamech, listen to my speech, for I have killed a man for wounding me, even a young man for hurting me. Cain shall be avenged sevenfold, and Lamech 77-fold.
All right, so if you're a hip hopper here, you could have put a little beat into that. And Zilna, hear my voice. Yep. Kyle's not a hip hopper, so. But you do know of a metal band called Avenged Sevenfold, right? They're named after that verse because they're evil characters. They're bad dudes, right? They named themselves after that. All right, note Seth's name, Genesis 4, 25 to 26.
Adam
So it's interesting how these names reflect their understanding. So Seth is named, he has replaced our previous seed. So talking about Abel. Abel's name means breath or vapor, which implies both shortness of life and also the presence of the Holy Spirit in his life. So Seth basically has a similar name to Cain, and with a meaning anyways. And again, it goes back to this understanding. How does it seem that Seth set a good example for his son Enosh? Does anyone know who Enosh is? He seems to have set an example for him. The word Enosh means mortal. What does it say about men during the time of Enosh? What does it say about them? Rhoda? Yeah, they begin to crowd to God. They begin to pray. So mortality ought to remind you of why you need to pray. It ought to remind you of that. So his name means immortal. Verse 26 says, men begin to call upon the name of the Lord. So this is something that we also have to teach our kids. Luke 11:1. So prayer, even though to some degree it comes naturally to people, in another sense, we really do need to get understanding about it. So your kids ought to see you pray. Kids ought to know that you pray. And so when this term stewardship of children comes, when that word is spoken to you, what comes to your mind? I want you to think about all the things that come to your mind. And probably the four most likely things to come to your mind are also biblical. So we're just going to look at these verses and write them down. But these are things that automatically come to my mind when I think of raising children right in the Lord. Stewardship of children. 1 Timothy 5:8, read that. So that's a good one, right? Providing for the kids. That comes to mind, right? My job is to feed and clothe these kids. Put a roof over their head. That's my responsibility as a father, my wife's responsibility as a mother. And as a guy, that's the first thing that pops into my mind. Provision. These kids are going to cost me an arm and a leg. Wow. It's all right, they're worth the cost, trust me. Isaiah 66:13. This is probably one that would come to the mind of a mother. Go ahead and read that for us, brother.
As one whom his mother comforted, so will I comfort you, and you shall be comforted in Jerusalem.
So isn't that true, Mom? You think that your job is to kind of comfort your kids, right? Nurture them, comfort them, give them love. Men aren't usually as much into that. I mean, we are. I'm a pretty affectionate guy with my kids. I've always been a very affectionate guy. But, I was also, I'm like, I'm going to give them guns. My wife's going to give them a hug. I'm going to buy them a BB gun. Right? Or a football or whatever you're into, right? Soccer ball, whatever you're into. And so it's just a little difference between men and women. But again, that kind of comes to mind when you think about child raising. Proverbs 23:13.
Do not withhold correction from a child, for if you beat him with a rod, he will not die.
Wow. I picked the most extreme one. But for some people, when they think of stewardship, they think of discipline. Okay? So I'm not going to quantify the rod thing. Because we know there's a difference between abuse and discipline. Right? And again, this generation doesn't understand that. They think abuse is like not buying your kid a car when they're 16. Right? That's ridiculous. But there is a difference. But don't get all in my face and say, oh, you support abuse. No, I might give you a spanking if you say that to me. Because I think you're a clown. Of course, people know the difference between abuse and discipline. But unfortunately, because of abuse, because there have been abuses, especially because our family structure is not what it used to be, you hear these terrible stories about some boyfriend of some single mom or step dad that kills their kids or, breaks their arms or whatever. But if I spank my kid on the back of the thigh because my kid was playing with matches, don't accuse me of abuse. Don't you dare. You don't know what the heck you're talking about. I'll teach you what some abuse looks like if you'd like to know. I know I'm old, fat, slow, and got a fake hip, but I'm still mean. All right, no, I'm just joking around. But I do want to make this clear because there's always someone that wants to say, well, yeah, but we're not talking about abuse here. Of course we're not. Why does that have to be said? Discipline is not abuse. Discipline is not abuse. I don't care what your mom said. I don't care what the schools teach. Because they're wrong. This used to be understood in our culture. We've lost the understanding. Deuteronomy 6:6-7.
And these words which I command you today shall be in your heart. You shall teach them diligently to your children, and shall talk to them when you sit in your house, when you walk by the way, when you lie down, and when you rise up.
So the other thing that comes to mind when I think of stewardship of children, and maybe you too, I would think, would be training them in right from wrong. Pretty simple. Training them right from wrong. Okay, this is hard for postmodern people to understand, but you need to understand what I'm about to say. Your children are not your personal property. Because when you see small-minded people, like when they get a divorce, right? They want to argue over the children, who gets to control the children. That's my kid, blah, blah, blah. It's really not. If you loved your kid, first of all, you wouldn't be getting the divorce. You'd be figuring out a way to work it out. Because you're killing your kids with the divorce. The divorce hurts the children. Right? But the other side of it is, especially, there's a kind of a class issue here. The less material possessions you have, the more you tend to think your children are property. In other words, poor people, this is a struggle of the lower classes, really tend to fight over their kids and treat them like property. That's my son. And so they get mad even when a kid is corrected at school. How dare you talk to my son like that? Well, your son probably needed a beat down from you when he was younger, but you didn't do it, so now the teacher's got to try to work with what's left. All right? The opposite, as you move through the socioeconomic, you have almost the opposite problem. People with money, upper middle class people, when they get divorces, what do they think? Well, you keep the kids. I'll just send them gifts every Christmas, and they send them like crazy gifts, they spoil them with gifts. But that's not what the kid needs. The kid needs their dad or their mom. So there's kind of a social thing there that's based on poverty and all that. It's a mindset. It's a class thing. But both of those extremes are wrong. They're both wrong. Kids are not your personal property, nor by spoiling them do you make up for a lack of being involved in their life. Okay, notice the next thing I said, they're not perpetual children. Okay, you really do got to move out of your mama's basement, bro. Get a job and move out, right? I understand there's economic things, there's kids that help out by paying rent. Hawaii, it's super expensive to own a house. So there's multi-generational people in there. But if you got a 30-year-old male child living at home and not paying rent, something isn't right. They're not perpetual children. I remember I was like 38 or something, and I went home to visit my mom. And I was like, hey, Mom, I'm going to borrow the car. I'm going to drive over to visit so-and-so. She's like, it's icy. When are you coming home? I'm like, Mom, I left home when I was 18. I was an airborne ranger in the Army. I'll be okay. But as soon as I got within her orbit, I wasn't Tim, I was Timmy. Right? I was her little boy again. And so, like, she's asking me when I'm coming home. It's like, Mom, I've been gone for 20 years. I'm visiting you now. Don't worry, I'm not going to, I'll be okay tonight. But, so it's hard for some parents to back off from that, especially moms. And so you got to be careful, moms. That's why you need dad to sit there and say, sign the papers and let him join the Marine Corps when he's 17. Don't tell your mother I did this. Is that what you did, Eric? No, his kids were over 18 when they joined. So they're not yours to keep forever. You got to let them find the will of God for their life. Okay. They must not be neglected nor spoiled. Those are the two extremes, right? Especially from learning their spiritual responsibilities. You've got to let kids learn their spiritual responsibilities. Matthew 19:14. And Jesus actually goes on to say, better a millstone be tied around your neck. One of these little ones not be allowed to learn. And so he's talking about parents that purposely keep their kids from hearing about the gospel. How do they illustrate this? Okay, we're going to read these next two stories. They're kind of longish. I hope we can finish in time. We'll race through it. But they just illustrate this stewardship principle from the Bible. And remember, these are true stories, number one. And number two, they're in here because they're informing us about our stewardship of our children. Go ahead and start with Genesis 22, 1-3. Go all the way to the end there, verse 14. All those who are reading that portion.
Now it came to pass after these things that God said to Abram and said to him, Abraham, and he said, Here I am. Then he said, Take now your son, only son, Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah, and offer him as a burnt offering on the mountain which I shall show you. So Abraham rose early in the morning and saddled his donkey and took two of his
All right, so there's a lot of theological issues behind this story, which I don't really want to get into. And so if you're new to this story, you don't really understand everything happening. But I just want to focus on the human side of it, not the theological side. The human side is Abraham is an extremely old man. He's over 100 years old at this point in his life. He's been promised a son his whole life. He's been waiting to have a son. The son is finally born when he's in his 90s, and now he's in his hundreds. And God, what does God say to do with the son? Offer him as a sacrifice. Now, the first thing you ought to know is that Abraham knows God. He's called a friend of God. So he knows that this goes against God's nature to ask, to make this, to command this. But nonetheless, does God have a right to do this? He absolutely does. He absolutely does. And if you know the nature of God, like Abraham, you know that God doesn't want human sacrifice. That God will never ask you to actually put your children on an altar and slay them. That's what the Satanists do. That's not what Christians do. Right? Christians and Jews aren't into that. That's a Satanist thing. Although in Islam, interestingly enough, parents will release their children to be suicide bombers because they think that's how they get to heaven. John?
Knowing the story, the faith of Abraham told his son, the Lord will provide. That is true. When he was going to sacrifice. But he told his son to get his son to go. God will provide. And his son realized he was going to be sacrificed. But Abraham said, by faith, God will provide because he knew God.
Yep, he knew God's nature. Now, maybe Isaac didn't know God's nature. So how do you think Isaac felt getting tied up and placed on that pile of wood? And there's Dad with the big old knife. Okay, Dad. But, in fact, I say that because Isaac learned something from his father. He learned, number one, that his father trusts God. Because as you said, John, before he was even put up there, he asked the question, where's the lamb for the sacrifice? And Abraham said, God is going to provide it. And so the lesson is actually learned by Isaac. The son is learning from the father. And this is how it'll be with your life if you raise your children knowing they don't belong to you. They might have to be sacrificed for something. But you're going to teach them how to trust God while sacrificing. See, that's not what you teach them when you spoil them. You're supposed to teach your kids how to trust God while sacrificing. So if you decide, the teenage years are the years you're going to run up your credit card and teach your children to be like that, you're stupid. You're setting a bad example. And, so my kids today will tell me they appreciate all the sacrifices. We didn't have a TV in our house. And boy, that made my oldest son still is mad about that a little bit. But nonetheless, they look back on those years and they realize, man, that was probably good for me. Some other things that they had to go through because my wife and I were in ministry. We had to move one time, our church, from Hawaii to California, and that was a big change for them. They learned a lot of things. And then there was a time when they wanted to go off and do their own thing. My son, TJ, we encouraged him to join the Army. He wanted to join, got a free scholarship to college. But then he had to go to Afghanistan. Wow, we encouraged him to go. Once he said he wanted to go, we said, we're behind you. And now what if he died over there? Wait, we were the ones that encouraged him after he said he wanted to join. But you see, this is the point. Is kids have to live their own life. They have to learn, number one, that they can trust God. That sometimes life, real life, means laying yourself on an altar from time to time. Right? And that at some point you're going to have to figure out, I've got to trust God no matter how bleak it looks. Because it must have been pretty bleak when Dad had that knife. All right. Okay, God, where's that? And it was right there in the thicket. Praise the Lord. So, again, the message of stewardship is powerful here. And again, there's a whole theological side to this story about teaching Abraham that God the Father was going to sacrifice his son for everyone. But that's another lesson. All right, one more story. Let's get through this, and we'll probably finish here. 1 Samuel 1, 8-9, all the way to the chapter 2, verse 11. So we're going to go through all those. Go ahead.
And she was in bitterness of soul and prayed unto the Lord and wept sore. And she vowed a vow and said, O Lord of hosts, if thou wilt indeed look on the affliction of thine handmaid, and remember me, and not forget thine handmaid, but will give unto thine handmaid a man child, then I will give him to the Lord in all the days of his life, and there shall no razor come upon his head.
Then Eli answered and said, Go in peace, and the God of Israel grant thee thy petition that thou hast asked of him. She said, Let thine handmaid find grace in thy sight. So the woman went her way and did eat, and her countenance was no more sad.
So it came to pass in the process of time that Hannah conceived and bore a son and called his name Samuel, saying, Because I have asked for him from the Lord.
Now the man Elkanah and all his house went up to offer to the Lord the yearly sacrifice and his vow. But Hannah did not go up, for she said to her husband, Not until the child is weaned, then I will take him, that he may appear before the Lord and remain there forever.
And when she had weaned him, she took him up with her, with 3 bullocks, and 1 ephah of flour, and a bottle of wine, and brought him unto the house of the Lord in Shiloh. And the child was young. And they slew a bullock, and brought the child to Eli. And she said, O my Lord, as your soul lives, my Lord, I am the woman that stood here praying unto the Lord. This child I prayed, and the Lord has given me my petition which I asked of him. Therefore also I have lent him to the Lord. As long as he lives, he shall be lent to the Lord. And he worshipped the Lord there.
And Hannah prayed and said, My heart rejoices in the Lord, my horn is exalted in the Lord. I smile at my enemies, because I rejoice in your salvation. No one is holy like the Lord, for there is none besides you, nor is there any rock like our God.
The Lord kills and makes alive. He brings down to the grave and brings up.
Then Elkanah went to his house at Ramah, but the child ministered to the Lord before Eli the priest.
All right, so Hannah can't have kids. She finally has a son. And what does she do with her son? Go ahead, say it. Gives him to the Lord. How does she give him to the Lord? Yeah, she leaves him at the tabernacle to work, to stay there for the rest of his life and minister the gospel. She basically lets him become a priest. Right? She basically says his whole life he's dedicated to you, Lord, that he would serve you all the days of his life. And he becomes the greatest prophet, right? He's the one that's going to anoint Saul and David. And so the entire future of the nation is affected because she decides this one belongs to God. She essentially tithes one of her kids to God. Why did she do it, though? Why was it easy for her to do? Will?
Because she knew that since she couldn't have child in the beginning, and God blessed her with him, so she turned into a way to belong to God.
She knew absolutely that this child doesn't belong to me anyways. I might as well put him to work for the Lord. We get to raise our kids, right? Sometimes God calls them, and especially for ministry. My mom wanted me to be a Catholic priest. I was like, nope. But then I became a preacher. And so she was like, really? Sorry, Mom. I gave my life to Jesus, and I'm going to preach the gospel. All right, we'll close. I know these last 4 scriptures, we're really at the end of time now, but let's just read them through. All right, these 3 most important things you can teach your children besides the gospel. These are my personal opinion. I raised 3 sons, or 2 sons rather, so it might be, these 3 might not apply to your kids, but I think they do. And these are just things we don't think about that we probably need to teach our kids. Romans 15:1.
We then, who are strong, ought to bear with the scruples of the weak and not to please ourselves.
So, raising boys, I thought, yeah, I'm going to teach them strong help the weak. And I didn't teach them to share either. Because sharing is socialism. So I taught them, you know what, if you have something and someone else doesn't have it, the strong help the weak. You ought to let them borrow your thing and then take it back. Or you can give stuff away. If you have extra, give it away. Give it away. Strong help the weak. But that's not the same as sharing. Because I didn't like kids walking up to my kids saying, you need to share, and try to take stuff away from my kids. That's called communism. I said socialism before because I was being polite. But there are good communists. They're the dead ones. Matthew 10:37.
He who loves father or mother more than me is not worthy of me, and he who loves son or daughter more than me is not worthy of me.
Yes, I taught my kids that I don't love them first. God comes first, and then my wife. My kids are pretty low on the totem pole after that. And I taught them that's the way it needs to be with them. They need to love God first, and someday they'll be married. They need to love their wife. James 4:14.
Whereas you know not what shall be on the morrow, for what is your life? It is even a vapor that appears for a little time and then vanishes away.
You have a short time to be a good steward with the life God gives you. Make the most of it. That's what Yoda means. You only die once. All right. And this is the final model for child raising, 3 John 1:4. Go ahead and read that nice and loud. I have no greater joy. And that's what you want for your kids. So you got to be a good steward. You got to be a good steward of those children. All right, we're out of time. I'm sorry to go, but we actually went over time today because I made a lot of jokes, but that's all right. We'll be preaching in 5 minutes. If you want to use the restroom or send your kids to the restroom, there's quite a few people out there that want to come in. So don't put all your personal items on the seat and all that. Make some room so people can come and get a good seat, all right? I really appreciate your faithfulness. Brother Vincent, why don't you close us in a word of prayer?